And so we're just approaching 7 o'clock. Won't be too long. And I'll just come back in at the end. And at the end, if you hang around, we'll finish. Bill will do his outro, and then I'll stop the recording, and then I'll let you guys know that we've stopped and you can chat.
Okay.
Okay, Bill, are you ready?
Ready.
David, are you fine? You're ready?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, Bill, if you want to count in now.
Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m, Wednesday, the 14th of July. You are watching episode 15 of Regional Wrap, providing an insight on issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me tonight on this episode, our Constitution, the separations of federal and state power, and the blurring of the line. My guest is Professor David Flint. Professor Flint read law and economics at the Universities of Sydney, London and Paris. After admission as a solicitor to the New South Wales Supreme Court in 1962, he practices as a solicitor for some 10 years before moving to the university teaching system, holding several academic posts before becoming Professor of Law at Sydney University of Technology in 1989. Is a retired professor at law, has been the chairman of the Australian Broadcasting Authority, chairman of the Australian Press Council from 1987 to 1997, and an associate member of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission from 1997 to 2004. Professor Flint is an author of numerous publications. He has been recognised with the award of World Outstanding Legal Scholar at World Jurist Association of Barcelona in October 1991. He was made a member of the Order of Australia in 1995. However, I believe Professor Flint's most notable achievement was reducing Eddie Maguire, Peter Fitzsimmons and Malcolm Turnbull to tears, when as the national convener of the Australians for Constitutional Monarchy, he was instrumental in securing the no vote to defeat the 1999 Republican referendum. David, welcome. Before we get into the heavy stuff, can you provide the audience with a little bit of an insight with your formative years and what set you on your career path?
Well, my formative years, I came to Australia. My parents were of mixed background. My father's family were Australian of English background. My mother's family came, my grandfather wanted to be a farmer. They were settlers in Indonesia, Dutch East Indies. They came to Australia. Probably, I would think of mixed blood, though they didn't talk about that. And they settled near Sydney in Blacktown, and my grandfather bought a farm. And when I was sent to school, and I went to a good school, a good state school, Sydney High, and I think I learned a lot in my education and from my parents about the values of our civilization. And I think that encouraged me very much. I wanted to be a lawyer. I thought that was my right career. I remember my grandfather, who was a strong Brethren. In those days, they weren't the exclusive Brethren, they were more like Quakers. And he said, he can't become a lawyer. All lawyers are liars. Nevertheless, I still became a lawyer and practiced law for a while, and then went into the university system. And I still have a very strong view in the virtue of democracy. I think what the Americans wrote in their Declaration of Independence really sums up just about everything about that, because they say there, we believe it to be self-evident, that man was endowed by his creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think the great words there, whether you're religious or not, is that man was endowed by his creator. And if you're not religious, that means by nature that we have these rights. They're not given to us by politicians and dictators and kings. They are our rights and we're entitled to them. And I think that is so fundamental to our system. One of the things that attracts me to what you're doing, Bill, is that I think this reflects very much the fact that we now live in a country where the political system has been captured. It's been captured by small cabals of people who run the political parties, and the parties, although they're elected, are not really reflecting what is the interest of the nation and the interest of the people of Australia. And I think there's very much something to be satisfied. And one of the things is obviously, it was a question at the time of federation itself, whether there should be new states in Queensland. And there was a strong movement for it then, and there still is. And I think that people should not be compelled to live in entities against their wishes and against their interests. And what has happened with, I think, the obsession of the federal government with such rates of immigration that they can't be absorbed easily. And at the same time, the practice now for many years of not developing much outside of the capital cities. And what we're getting is these massive metropolises in Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne. They're too large in a continent which is sparsely populated, the least populated continent in the world. We're living on top of one another in Sydney and in southeast Queensland and in Melbourne, and there should be much more development across the country. That won't occur unless there are states, unless the people of those areas develop their own states and have their own governments, instead of everything being run from Sydney, everything being run from Brisbane, everything being run from Melbourne, and then nationally everything being run from Canberra. And it's over-centralised, being run by people who are not really competent to run those things. I often say I'm developing a movement, Take Back Your Country. And I often make a comment, and I ask people whether they would challenge it. I cannot think of a problem today, not one significant problem in Australia, which, if it were not created by the politicians, has been made significantly worse by the politicians. I can't think of one. And when I speak, I often challenge people, invite people to say, well, am I wrong? Can you think of something which they've done so wonderfully that we should be indebted to them? We should not only pay them well, but when they retire early because they want to be with their families and go and work on income from the Communist Chinese or wherever they get their income, should we be so grateful to our politicians? And I don't think we should be. And I think what we need more states. We need states closer to the people, but states where the politicians are really working there in the interest of the people. So I'm talking too long. It's your program, and I've taken over.
No, that's a fine introduction to the system. And I mean, so COVID or the pandemic from the COVID over the last 18 months that it's dragged out, I mean, really shows suddenly the states have got a hairy chest and they're thumping on it that we can do this and that, as long as the Commonwealth pays the bills and sends the checks. Whereas over the last probably 50 years or more, states acquiesce some of their power in regards to their responsibility for easy money. And this is one of the subjects I want to just touch on in regards to horizontal fiscal equalisation. And with the states, we know the Constitution laid out certain responsibility for the federal government and for the state governments. But over the time, the fact that the Commonwealth has been able to bribe the states in regards to, well, if you comply with our education policy and sort of national curriculum and stuff will give you a bucket of money and you don't have to worry about it. And so we now have a dumbed down centralized education where education was actually a responsibility of the states, and they effectively could have their own curriculums and own education system and be competitive, and we find out which one's the best. And then you'd find that the states would basically, if one was showing better results or initiative, that those lagging states would try to catch up. But now with the Commonwealth, they can just dumb the whole thing down. Do you see that as a problem in regards to the way things are work between the Commonwealth and the states at the moment?
Bill, I think you're absolutely right. This is the big problem of Australia. We are now the most concentrated federation, fiscally and in terms of powers, than any other in the democratic world, in any other comparable country. We are the worst. For example, take tax. In Australia, an unbelievable amount of the total taxation is taken by the Commonwealth. 80% of all taxes. Nothing like that in America, nothing like that in Canada, nothing like that in Germany or Switzerland. That's what's happened. I think, and we had a splendid constitution. The founders of this country, led by the former Chief Justice of Queensland, and Premier of Queensland, rather, not Chief Justice, Premier, I think he may well have been that too, but he was certainly the Premier of Queensland, Sir Samuel Griffith. He drafted the Constitution, and it was a superb Constitution. But as with all constitutions, as with all human documents, it wasn't perfect. I think they made at least 3 errors. One was the conditional grants under what's called Section 96. The Commonwealth can make grants to the states on condition. They didn't put a horizon on that. It should have been for 10 years, 20 years. It should have gone. They're still doing it. They're still taking the money, so much of the taxes, and then handing a certain amount to the states, but doing it on condition, as you rightly said, in education. So that's the first thing, the Section 96. The second thing is they didn't put down in writing something which everybody assumed was the case. Everybody thought this was the case. And that was, you have a list of powers, a few, 2 or 3 exclusive powers of the Commonwealth, the rest to be shared with the states, but if the Commonwealth wanted to, they could take them over. So all those powers you see in the Constitution, those belong to the Commonwealth. Those that are not there, everybody thought was reserved to the states. So, for example, education, as you rightly said, education is not mentioned in the list of powers. It's reserved to the states. It's not a Commonwealth matter. But the original High Court said yes. They said, yes, these are all reserved to the states. But by 1920, some of the people who wanted to make the Federation, the central government, Canberra, much more powerful than the founders intended and the people approved, what happened there was that by 1920 you had a different bench of judges. The judges in the first few years they were the founders. They'd written the Constitution, they knew what it meant, and they said, yes, of course, these powers are reserved to the states. But by 1920, in a case called the Engineers case, the High Court, listening to arguments from a clever barrister, Robert Menzies, QC, Casey rather, because we had a king at the time, Robert Menzies argued, and barristers argue what is in the interest of their clients. I'm not blaming Menzies for arguing this. He argued there's no reserved powers doctrine in the Constitution. You just interpret these like a statute. You give them the plain English meaning. So the judges decided from that time, from the Engineers case, that they would no longer assume any powers were reserved to the states. They would just interpret the Constitution as they saw it. And by the time the Commonwealth entered into treaties about various things, that is under the external affairs power, the Commonwealth started saying, the High Court started saying, oh, since you've entered into a treaty on that, you can introduce legislation to enforce that treaty or to give effect to that treaty. So the Commonwealth got all these powers, more and more to them. And that was the third problem in drafting the Constitution. They made the big mistake of giving the High Court great powers, final powers, apart from the Privy Council, but basically final powers on the interpretation of the Constitution. But what they did was they said, oh, the High Court judges should be appointed by the Governor General, effectively by the federal cabinet. So if you want judges who consciously or unconsciously think that increased central power is a good thing, have them appointed by the federal government. What they should have done was said, well, the next judge will be from Queensland, and the one after that, New South Wales, the one after that, Victoria, go right round the Commonwealth. Keep making sure that the judges came from the states and not from the centre. So those were three mistakes. The result is all of these powers are being exercised by the Commonwealth, I say unconstitutionally, because it was not the intention of the Constitution. Have I got a moment to just say something more?
Yes.
Well, when I was involved in the referendum, some of the people, we had this enormous grassroots base. Some of the people asked me, and I got a number of people asking me, so I decided I'd better check on it. What if we win this referendum and they put a second referendum? What's the chance of that passing? Say we win the first one. Well, I looked at it and I found, to my great interest, that every time the Commonwealth had put a question and had it defeated by the people, the next time the people said no. There was no instance where a defeated referendum was reversed. And some of the same issues went up to 5 times. And you may wonder, well, we don't seem to have referendums these days. There hasn't been one since the Republic referendum, which wasn't one of those ones of a transfer of power. And when I thought about it, this was back in 1999, I thought, but all of those powers that they wanted, they wouldn't need to ask for them anymore. The High Court has given them effectively control over those powers. Now that's a disaster. May I say a few more words why it's a disaster?
Of course.
It's a disaster because, firstly, you get the two trying to run the same thing, as they do with education. They're both trying to run it. The result is nobody really runs it. What's happened is they've handed over the schools, the curriculum has been handed over to the neo-Marxists who set up these outrageous curriculums, which are basically an attack on, they seem to be targeting white heterosexual males, but they wanted to destroy values. They want to introduce all sorts of theories, critical theories they call them, critical theories of race, critical gender theory. They're putting into the minds of children the idea that they really want to change their sex and they should have operations to change that, or have doctors do things to them, give them all sorts of medicines to change that. They are abusing the children, and they're running down the standards so that our standards are declining precipitously compared with the countries of the north, even in one instance in relation to Kazakhstan. And we're losing in relation to literature, we're losing in relation to mathematics, we're losing in relation to science. It's not the fault of the children. The children are being badly taught as more money is poured into education, with both the Commonwealth and the states trying to run it. Now, this business of the Commonwealth and the states trying to run the same thing leads to a lot of loss. There was a report done for the premiers a few years ago, which immediately was put away in a cupboard, by Professor Toomey from Sydney University, who's a professor of constitutional law, and Professor Withers, who's an economist. What they found was that if we rearranged our federation, so it went back to what it was intended and what the people originally agreed to, and what they always said no to in each of the referendums. If it went back to the Commonwealth doing its performing its special powers, the result would be we would save a lot of money, because a lot of money goes down the drain. If you have Commonwealth and states trying to run things, the cost is enormous. And they calculated that the saving would be about 10% of gross domestic product. That's today is about $160 billion. That's not a one-off. That's every year. $160 billion if we ran ourselves like Switzerland or Germany. And that seems to me to be a reasonable solution. But I said it was disastrous. It's disastrous for another reason, another good reason. And that is Canberra doesn't seem to have the ability to try and run the state's matters and run its own. Take defence. We are, in many ways, defenceless at the moment for two principal reasons. First, they raid the defence budget. It started with Labor, and the Liberals made it even worse. They used the defence budget to soak out billions for electoral purposes. And the latest was the submarines thing with the French, which was going to save some seats in South Australia for the Liberal Party. That's costing us it's costing an enormous fortune, and we're not going to get those submarines for a long time. At the time of the centenary of the defeat of Japan in 2045, there'll no doubt be a naval review in Sydney Harbour. And to annoy my Republican friends, I point out that will be presided over by the King, probably King William. King William will preside at the naval review. When all the vessels parade past the King, there won't be the full French-built fleet, because they're still going to be delivering the fleet. And we're spending all this money. And do they think that hostile enemies of Australia, if they're going to attack us, are going to hold off until we get our fleet? That is the tragedy of what's going on. And the other thing they do about defence, I think that they have destroyed, the politicians have destroyed the morale of our soldiers, sailors and airmen by what they did with their Brereton report. Once they got that 4-year Brereton report, instead of putting it away and deciding what they would do with it, the Prime Minister came out and said that there were brutal truths in that, and that there would be serious action taken. Now they've set up a prosecution service. The poor old soldiers who risked their lives in Afghanistan, having 4 years put up with this, and some of them having decided it wasn't worth living with that sort of thing. This is going to go on for another few years. And eventually I suspect they'll decide that they haven't got the evidence, or there isn't sufficient evidence, and they won't go.
But the damage is done.
Damage is done. And this is the primary, the biggest reason why the Commonwealth was created by the people in Australia in the 19th century, because they feared that we would be attacked. They set up the Commonwealth, and the first duty of the Commonwealth is the defence of the Commonwealth. I hope the new minister, he seems to be the first minister for defence we've had, for a real minister for defence that we've had, and I hope he will. He's a Queenslander, isn't he?
Yeah, Dutton.
He will, I hope, improve things, but of course he can only do what the cabinet will agree to. So this is one of the tragedies of what's happened in the misinterpretation of the Constitution against the wishes of the people. What could be more undemocratic than that?
Well, my feeling on the Constitution in regards to the people who sat down and thought about it and drafted the Constitution, I suppose because they were so like-minded across the country. Remember, there was John Forrest coming across from West Australia. There was Griffiths coming down from Queensland. There was Park and Deakin and all these different personalities. But they managed to pull it off, And the thing is, I think because even though they've had their differences in that, they managed to come out with a document that was basically from the heart of each of them. And I suppose when they wrote it, they also expect the people to come after them would be the caliber of politicians that they were. Firstly, they weren't just odds and sods. These people were great men in their time. You know, it wasn't just someone who had been a staffer at some time with someone as a clerk and then promoted up the chain of the party and then foisted onto the public. These were men with great caliber. And I suppose when they drafted that constitution, they expected the same caliber of people to follow on after them. And I think that's where, when they wrote the constitution, they probably left it open because they had that same expectation that the ones that followed would do it the same way as them. Because the thing that gets me in regards to Chapter 6 of the Constitution, which is the creation of new states. Now, Griffiths and all those people were patently aware of the goings-on in Central and North Queensland, trying to separate from the Central Queensland and North Queensland's trying to separate from the colony of Queensland. So they knew that problem, and they also knew history in regards to, had been a petition in about 1871, and there was another petition in 1890. And it got debated a fair bit in the Queensland Parliament. But the thing was, there had been all these promises over time that even Griffiths was involved at one time. Well, we'll make it autonomous as far as the finances going. We'll have finances for North Queensland, Central Queensland, and the Southern Division. Now, they've actually brought legislation to Parliament for that sort of breakup, so that each area had some sort of autonomy over the fundings that were generated from there and the way it was spent. But although none of that legislation ever passed, so when they went to the federation system and they wrote the Constitution, it's quite surprising to me, considering how difficult the state parliaments had been in regards to Central and North Queensland tried to separate. And even if you go back to history, when the New South Wales Parliament desperately tried to stop Queensland from breaking away, but when they drafted the Constitution, they put it completely in the hands of the state parliament whether they would take action to allow the separation. And I think that's one failing of the Constitution. Unless you can get the state government, coerce them into giving you a referendum of that, there's no other mechanism to get a separate state. Whereas in the colonial days, you could bypass the parliament. You didn't have to go. Queensland didn't have to go to get approval from from the Sydney Parliament. It simply went to the governor, gave him a petition, sent it over to the colonial office, and it was considered there. So that's how I do it. But now we've locked into this situation. We can only get a separate state if we can convince or coerce the state government to give us the referendum, which happened in 1967 with New South Wales for New England. Is that the sort of thing you're alluding to, that the founders weren't tight enough in regards to ensuring the aims of the Constitution were going to be set in concrete?
I suspect that in relation to that clause, that was put in, I suspect, to make sure that they got the Queensland politicians in Brisbane on side. They were frightened of losing the Queensland politicians. So it's been left, as you rightly say, to the consent of the Parliament thereof, meaning the Queensland Parliament, which means a now one-chamber Parliament, and they can decide everything in relation to there being new states. I think that is a weakness in the Constitution. I suspect it was done for out of fear that the Queensland politicians might not come along with federation.
Well, further to that, Queensland actually didn't participate in some of the conventions towards the end because of that issue. And there was, I think it was 1897 or that, there was a secret, what they call the secret premiers convention, where they obviously thrashed out a bit more in the constitution, and we ended up with this. And I'll just share the screen. We've got a section there, that's part 2, the Senate, and in there we've got this compromise. But until the Parliament of the Commonwealth otherwise provides, the Parliament of the State of Queensland, if that be a state of an original state, so this was the bribe to make sure that they joined the Federation right at the first thing, may make laws dividing the state into divisions and determining the number of senators be chosen for each division. So that was the compromise they put into the Constitution to allow Queensland, or appease Queensland. Well, at least you can, if you join the Federation, you can divide your state in half and have 6 senators there and 6 senators there. And that was a compromise. But here's the funny thing about it. That section sat in the Constitution right up until about 1984 or 5 or whatever, and was never used, right? And until the Commonwealth otherwise decides, Mr. Bob Hawke jumped in and he decided otherwise. And that section is basically gone now. Queensland is locked into the same system as everyone else. The Senate is elected on the basis of the whole state. And basically, I would expect that was because they never used that clause in the whole time of the being state of the statehood. So I think that was, you can see there the twists and turns to coerce separatist Central and North Queensland. Well, at least you get the senators to join the Federation, so just shut up for a while, and then we've got stuck with this whole thing.
Yes, well, I agree with you, and I think it was lamentable that Hawke did that. Also, it was lamentable that he made the Parliament so much bigger. So we have such a large Parliament, larger than I think we need. I think what this movement that I am in the process of trying to start, Take Back Your Country, what we want to do, we argue, and we as we get over this this medical crisis, as we get over that, what we want to do, we want to say that this constitution for over 120 years has never been examined by the people. It's been examined by all sorts of elite groups. It's never been really examined by the people. The great conventions that we held in 1891, which was a nominated convention, the subsequent one in 1897, which Queensland didn't really take part in, or much, it was the 1897 convention, which was intended to be elected. They were trying to get most of the delegates elected, not all of them were. But the idea was that it would be an elected one. That's the sort of thing I think we need. We need, and I suspect this may be the only one of the ways in which changes can be made to the Constitution, which would, for example, allow new states to emerge. And that is if there were a genuine look at the Constitution again, but by the people. I think we should always remember that it wasn't until the people got involved in the drafting of the Constitution that the whole thing went ahead. The original convention in 1891, which contained the Constitution, the writing of which was led by Queenslander Sir Samuel Griffith, went back to all of the state parliaments, and they all split up among themselves, and nobody could ever agree on anything. And it became very clear that it would never get through. There was still a strong feeling in the country for federation, particularly in the border areas. And there was a conference at Corowa in 1893, and it was there that Sir John Quick moved a motion that the next convention should be elected and not nominated. And this is the most important part of what he wanted, which became known as the Convenor Plan, was once the convention worked out the constitution, they would then consult with everybody, with the general public, with the politicians and so on. They then consider that consultation, come back with the final draft of the constitution, which would then be put directly to the people in each state. So it wouldn't need parliamentary approval. And that was the way in which they got it, by involving the people directly in the Convenor Plan. And I think we need a second Convenor Plan, where the people would again look at the constitution. You could have a convention, I would say an unpaid convention, which would look at, be elected, and not have people standing as members of parties. They could be members of groups, but not of registered political parties. And that convention should have the task of reviewing the constitution. And I would hope that among the things that would come out of that would be empowering the Australian people much more than they are. For example, empowering them in a viable area to institute, if they wish, their own referendum. And I think that could well result, properly represented and with the right views being presented for discussion there, we could see something which would allow for the development of new states, which is, as I agree with you, is crucial.
Well, we've still got the possibility of new states under the current system, provided we can coerce the state government to do it. Now, in 1965, before the state election in New South Wales, Cutler, I think it was Cutler, not the governor, Cutler, but I think it must have been his brother or something. Can't remember his first name.
It was his brother, I think. Yes.
Yeah, he was the leader of the Country Party, and of course, the New England New State movement. Basically, if you wanted to get elected as a Country Party member in northern New South Wales, if you weren't full on about the separate state of New England, you were never going to get endorsed, and you were never going to get elected. And the movement had some 130 in those days. Local newspapers were all independent, and Victor Thompson had managed to sort of organise them all in support. So you had, basically from Dubbo to the Queensland border, you had all these independent newspapers, local newspapers, supporting the New England New State movement, and they exerted tremendous pressure on the Country Party to support their proposition. And it wasn't all the town meetings, it wasn't the petitions, it wasn't the $100,000 £100,000 drive that they had in about 1961 that actually got the referendum up. It was simply the fact that they had sort of got into the influence the Country Party to be part of their policy. So when they went to the 65 election, Country Party made the agreement with Askin that if they won, you would deliver a referendum for the people of New England. And that was agreed to before they went to the election. They won the election, and Askin had to deliver. However, he didn't have to write the question in the most positive way to ensure that victory would result for the referendum. Mainly because I think they'd only come back to power after 41 years, and that was the first time they were back, and they only held the state by 2 seats in the lower house. So imagine if they had went to a referendum and the referendum won, and all of a sudden you had all of New England and the greater part of northeast of New South Wales taken out, and all those Country Party seats taken out. All of a sudden, you'd have a completely different parliament in Sydney, where you've lost all the support of these 10 or so Country Party seats. Now, Liberals would be 8 seats behind Labor and sent into the wilderness. So it wasn't in their best interest to have that petition, that referendum succeed. So they're the things that sort of can happen. But like I say, if we can influence a party to bounce of power or be a major or minor party in a government, we do have hope of getting a separate state in that way. But in regards to bettering the constitution, do you think there's any merit in picking some areas that are a problem and sort of find a champion or whatever to force a referendum on that item as a start to clean up, especially the separation of powers, and get that into a referendum that has, would likely get some public support?
Yes. Let me just get back to that question of a general convention. I don't think that's the only solution. I think you're absolutely right to be following that course of trying to get one through the state. They're tricky though, as you know. Either they won't give it to you unless they're in that position that Askin was in, but then Askin did the dirty on the Country Party, because when they drew the boundary, got somebody to draw the boundaries, there was some commission. As you know, he included Newcastle, which was anti a new state, and which was a strong Labour area. It wasn't even part of New England, but he, as I understand it, he threw in Newcastle, which of course made sure that any majority in New England in favour would defeat that referendum. But I think you're absolutely right to keep on pushing that. I think that there's also merit in a general convention, but that's also very difficult to get. Now, if you ask me about referendums, another of the weaknesses of the Constitution is that although they brought in the Swiss-style referendum, and they weren't going to initially, they were thinking of other ways to change the Constitution, and most constitutions were not changed by referendums. Referendums were not that much used, and they were highly misused by Napoleon. They got a very dirty name from Napoleon, who absolutely misused them and probably cooked them up as well. But the idea of the referendum, a Swiss idea, was accepted by the politicians, but they left the initiation to at least one house. Normally, in every case, it's been two, but at least one house, and the Governor General agreeing to put that to a referendum. So the Senate, even the Senate can't do it by itself, because the government would not allow the Governor General to approve sending it if they didn't want it to go. So the number of referendums is very much tightly controlled by the politicians. There's often a lot of whinging about Australia. Australia's never approved referendums. They won't update the Constitution. Well, of course, almost every referendum the Canberra politicians have put to the people has been about giving them more power. And the people don't want to give the Canberra politicians more power. We have two on the cards at the moment. There's always the Republic one, and Labor promises to have a referendum. Now they've, both the Australian Republican movement and the Labor Party have dropped plebiscites for 20 years. They're going to precede the referendum with two plebiscites to soften everyone up and apply the principle that applies in the European Union, that you have to keep on voting until you get it right. That was the tactics, but I think they've realized that that's hopeless, so they're going to now produce a model. The other referendum on the cards at the moment is a lot of people are calling for an Indigenous voice. That is, that you have this, and I do think, and I thought of that with that before Turnbull used the words, and it wasn't my original thought of mine, but I think of it as a third chamber to the Parliament, an advisory chamber, but the media, particularly the left-wing media, will make it very big, and it'll be a major impediment, and that's to have this Indigenous referendum, which will create a new class of politicians. It won't solve, no doubt, it won't solve at all the problems, the gap that the indigenous people in the remote areas suffer from. It won't solve that. It won't solve any of those problems. You'll just create a new class of politicians. But your argument that if we can fall on a problem which is obvious and then campaign about it and ask for a referendum, it would be an interesting thing to do. But for example, say you took education, you'd have to ask for a referendum to make sure that education goes back to the states. But on the other hand, there's no guarantee that the states are going, some states will. There'll always be a state that once you have the power sent back to the various compartments, one state emerges and does things brilliantly, as Sir Joe Bjelke-Petersen did in relation to death duties. Nobody else did. If we'd been a central state with no central government in Canberra or no state governments, that would have never happened. We'd still have death duties, and I think they were terrible tax. I remember that when I was working as a clerk in a law firm, how terrible they were, how they hurt people terribly at a time when they were suffering from the death of the leading entrepreneur in the family, the farming families, they were small business, and it was a shocking thing. And they had to pay out a fortune to the state government and a small fortune to the federal government because somebody had died. Sometimes in impossible situations, you just destroyed the business. It'll be hard to get a referendum up, I would think, because you'd have to create such shock that there would be an enormous call in the country for that referendum, and you'd be putting a lot of effort into it. And whether you'd actually get it would be another thing. But I see a virtue always in people acting. I think always we have to think, well, what's the best use of resources to do that? And that's a matter for your organisation, Brisbane, and you have to decide the best way to achieve that. And obviously, I think you've decided that in many ways the best way is politically by getting up local politicians, as I understand it, who will represent it. And I can well understand that. If you haven't got the local politicians supporting it, you're not going to.
Well, we have to replace some of them with our own.
That was the wonderful thing in New South Wales when you had a separate country party. And
I think that's one of the big demises. Where, like, if we still had this old situation that they have in New South Wales, where the National and the Liberals were separate, I think we would be hitching our sails or horses to the National Party, the same way as the New England movement hitched their wagon to the Country Party, because it's just a natural sort of fit. But we don't have that luxury, so we've got to think of something different. Just changing the subject a little bit, state constitution. I'm quite amazed when I read. Well, I've gone through and after reading the Queensland Constitution, gone through and read the other states' constitutions just briefly, sort of not in depth. But I'm just surprised how, well, they're just a piece of toilet paper. Like, there's no, we'll have a judiciary, and all it talks about is what we're going to pay them. There's nothing about how it's going to be audited or stuff like that. You know, we'll crack the Supreme Court, but it mainly focus on how we're going to pay for these judges. And when you look at local government, there's a bit of a story in there, but there's no powers or anything like that. Whole thing is just a nothing document. There's nothing solid in it like there is in the federal constitution. Are you or have you never looked at the state constitution? Are you surprised that they're not just a reincarnation of the federal constitution, and then take out the bits that are sort of, you know, belong to you and belong to us, and then this is what we adhere to? But just such a weak sort of document, I find.
I think that most of this is historical. When I look at state constitutions, I look particularly at what they can't do without a referendum. I think that's crucial, because you might remember you will surely remember, I have no doubt you remember, that the Queensland Upper House was abolished without a referendum. There'd been a referendum not to abolish it. It wasn't a binding referendum, so they just abolished it without a referendum, making a provision in the Constitution. And you can put something in the Constitution which can only be changed with a referendum. They put a provision in the Constitution: you can't restore the Upper House in Queensland unless you have a referendum. Fortunately, I found that
the interesting thing about the, I think it was, the vote was just in maybe just before 1920, and the referendum to keep it. And then I think with what's his name, Red Ted Theodore was the premier, and basically what he did is, because they controlled both the upper house and the lower house at the time, they basically got the upper house, the legislative council, all of its members to fall on their sword and basically quit, of course, with their pensions and things like that. So they just dissolved it, even though the referendum before was to keep it. So that was quite an interesting thing, that they just, basically dissolved themselves rather than the people dissolving or having anything to say. So that's a very interesting concept. But I also get the problem that I don't know if they saw the problems coming on in the future in regards to just having this single house. Now, it's all fine when you're the one in power. You haven't got this upper house to contend with. But when you're out of government, the other mob are just doing what they want. So it's quite a sort of strange situation that there is no checks and balances, and the fact that the people of Queensland have tolerated it so long.
it is. I think a state does need an upper house. Those constitutions, as you say, don't read like the federal constitution, with at least strong rules about what can be changed and what can't, notwithstanding the High Court. And of course, a lot is from the date of the constitutions. They were granted by a colonial government, allowing self-government. It was a great move to give self-government to the colonies, and to let the colonies rule themselves internally. And that was a tremendous advance. But a lot was left to the local parliament to work out what the constitution should contain. So they're not very, as you say, they're not very protective documents. And of course, the British themselves never had a single written constitution. They had things referred to as the constitution, but nothing which could not be changed by Parliament. And that the weakness of that has been shown by what happened with the Baird government, not the Blair government of New South Wales, the Blair government in England, where very significant changes were made to the constitution, just really in the House of Commons, because the House of Lords by that time was just
rubber stamp.
Yes. And you got for example, abolishing the office of Lord Chancellor and establishing a Supreme Court. And that's changed very much. The introducing subsequently another government introducing fixed terms. All of these went against the constitutional principles of Britain, which are supposed to gradually evolve. There are times when things are done suddenly, like the 1688, when King James II was forced out, and they broke the succession by offering the throne to his daughter and his son-in-law, William and Mary of Orange. And but the states don't have very strong constitutions. But fortunately, a lot of the key parts are still protected by referendums. Not all of them, as we saw in Queensland. They've also taken away from every state the power of the upper house to withhold supply. That used to be a constant problem in Victoria, and they abolished that by changing the constitution. So the states have weaker upper houses. Probably, I suspect now that the New South Wales upper house is probably one of the strongest. And that's where we have Mark Latham, and before him, or still with him, Fred Nile playing significant roles in...
Fred Nile's been replaced by...
Lyle Shilton. Yes, he will be.
Lyle Shilton, yes. formerly alongside Bernardi in regards to the Australian Conservatives. I think that he was sort of running.
Yes. So it's a different world, but the states don't have the strong constitutions. The Americans had various documents which are constitutional documents, but as the revolution approached, they tended to adopt much constitutions which many of them reflected what was in the Declaration of Independence, for example, the Virginia Constitution, or there was a Virginia Declaration similar to that in the Declaration of Independence. And it would be open to the states to adopt much more powerful constitutions, but the politicians wouldn't do that unless they were forced into it by enormous pressure.
I think with the constitution sort of weakened as it is and the centralisation of power back to Canberra, the thing I fear is this intergenerational bureaucracy in Canberra. We'll be getting to the stage when you have, third, fourth, fifth, and eventually sixth generations of people basically born in the ATC, going to university in the ACT, and getting a job with the government, the federal government in the ATC, and their knowledge of the world or even their own country is be so limited. They're out of touch now, but I can see them just getting further and further out of touch as that intergenerational sort of people in the public service continue.
I think you're right. This is one of the great problems, because the political parties have tried to discourage the role of the members of the parties. We unfortunately don't have the American primaries. In the American primaries, as you know, it's not just the members of the party who vote in pre-selections, it's anybody who's registered as a supporter in most states. And that allowed Trump and Cruz to emerge as the top two Republican candidates. Had it been left to the party, we would have had a Jeb Bush or somebody like that as the Republican candidate. So the people, whatever people think of President Trump, he was the strong choice of the supporters of the Republican Party. And Cruz would have been number two, I think, not the ones that the Republican establishment chose, but our political parties, unlike any other, I think, in the comparable world, are much more restricted and much more under the control of cabals of power brokers, all of them. I notice there's a bit of a change in New South Wales. Over the weekend, they had plebiscites where people actually voted, party members actually voted in a pre-selection, which is unheard of in New South Wales, because those were really run strongly from the centre. And it'll be interesting to see if that expands in New South Wales. But given that we have political parties, one of the reforms which I proposed in this thing, which is may I mention where people can look at it?
Yes.
It's at change.org/take back your country. Change.org/take back your country. People can look at it, but one of the things that we wanted is to reform the political parties, because the political parties receive an enormous advantages, financial and exemptions from the law of privacy, for example. In return for that, they should have to be open, transparent, and democratic, which most of them aren't. Open, transparent, and democratic. They're being run very much as closed cabals of power brokers controlling the political parties.
Well, you see that at pre-selections. The local branch, comes up with a candidate that they're willing to put the foot soldiers on the ground, raise money, and be out there at election booths and campaign for them, and they're quite happy with the candidate that they've selected, and all of a sudden the executive or the party comes in and says, no, he's out, we want this lady in there because we need more women in parliament or something like that. And obviously it must be soul destroying for the people who are, the grassroots of the party, get overridden like that.
Yes.
In regards to, as I was just talking about with the growing nepotism and sort of intergenerational thing with Canberra, I see this future in regards to if this situation keeps building and building and building, where we just see centralisation power in Canberra. My view is that states like Western Australia, I mean, West Australia is a bit different to everyone. They arc up at the most thing. I mean, they actually had a referendum to leave the Federation that what they won in about 1933, and was overturned by the British Parliament in regards to it was void and that. So, and unfortunately, because it was also the height of the Depression, it probably wasn't a very good time to go alone. But I notice now there's again murmurings. There's actually talk about succeeding again, and I think it might catch on to other states, especially like Queensland. If we feel like we're just being used and abused, there's probably merit in saying, well, we're not getting a good deal from the Commonwealth. We might as well be our own country. And I think that may come into play, maybe not in our lifetime, or maybe not for another 25, 30 years. But is that something you could foresee if we don't do something to address this concentration in power in Canberra?
At one stage, I did think that the way that Western Australia was being treated in relation to the GST, and the fact that they'd had a lot of their resources stolen, I think, by the Whitlam government, offshore resources, which I think should have been restored to them. And I could see that there would have been a lot of upset about that. There was a Wexit party in the last election, completely overshadowed, wasn't it, though, by the I prefer to call it the Wuhan virus. But that virus really overshadowed everything, and the Premier obviously won on that, I think. But that doesn't mean that it won't come back. And I think Western Australia would be the strongest one. And I think Queensland has legitimate concerns, because Queensland and Western Australia give a lot in terms of wealth to the Commonwealth, to the country, but don't take as much away. And the same with Northern Queensland. Northern Queensland is a tremendously wealthy part of Queensland, contributes an enormous amount to the wealth, but doesn't really get that much back. And I think that people will, properly informed people will react to that.
Well, the iron ore coming out of West Australia and the coal coming out of Queensland, somehow if our country wasn't blessed with that, we would be definitely in dire straits in regards to our finances. And Canberra is never going to solve the problem by creating wealth itself.
No.
You can print money, but that doesn't help.
True.
Just before we wrap up, because we're just gone over there, my feeling is if we picked one new thing to go into the Constitution under a referendum, my feeling is we, like the French in their Constitution, they made French official language, and there's very few countries that actually got their official language in the Constitution, basically because they probably always thought it was a given. you think if we pick one, or this is my one that I like, you can give me the item that you think can be a good referendum question. But I'd like to see a referendum in and add somewhere in about 3A, that English becomes our official language, and that goes to a referendum question. Just to finally get us under this one umbrella that we're locked into this one language and we're one people, rather than 198 different tribes. We have to provide written material and interpreters for.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. And I think there should be a national language. It should be acknowledged that English is the national language. My suggestion would be to introduce a clause probably after 128, which deals with the referendum, 128A, which would empower the Australian people by petition to initiate a referendum to change the Constitution, or to initiate laws, or to reflect on reverse a ruling in a court judgment. But I think the Australian people should be empowered by an appropriate petition. The Premier of South Australia at the time of Federation was interested in this and was actually proposing it, but Deakin talked him out of it. A power in the people, apart from the politicians, of themselves, by petition, raising a petition, and not just a plebiscite, a binding referendum, which could have significant change or small change in Australia as the people wish. In other words, I think that the power of the people should be enhanced in our Constitution. That would be
when we do have referendums, there's quite often more than one question. So maybe that's the first pair to go off together.
Good.
If I can just touch on one last subject, my sort of favourite thing in regards to making the people like Maguire, Fitzsimmons and Turnbull cry. How much satisfaction did getting the no vote through give to you and the people who, well, we weren't financed or anything, and where the others had heaps of support from the captains of industry? How monumental and how much elation do you and your supporters have when that decision was reached?
We had a function in Sydney that night. We were going to go to the town hall where we had all our functions before, but they refused to allow us to go there. Although they weren't holding any functions, and the New South Wales, the Sydney City Council put posters up, banners up all over the city to vote yes, which is outside of their powers, and I think the auditor should have found them guilty of an offence, but nothing happened over it. We were elated because this was a referendum which was supported by all of the mainstream media. All of the newspapers were Republican, all of the principal capital city newspapers, all of the television stations. We had a couple of people in the media. One was Alan Jones. Alan Jones used to say, if you don't know, vote no, to his listeners. But it was also against the great majority of the politicians. I would say at least 2/3 of the politicians, and only a small number of the politicians put their heads above the parapet to support us. And we didn't have much money. We certainly didn't have the money that Malcolm Turnbull's group had. But it was very encouraging. And we did have a very nice function that night. We didn't go overboard, but we had a good function. And I remember Turnbull saying that if John Howard were remembered for anything, it would be for the man who broke the heart of the nation. I remember the next day looking over Bondi, seeing people enjoying themselves, the usual beach scene over Bondi Beach. I didn't see anybody crying. There was no sadness. There was just the usual elation. I don't know what they thought about the referendum, but I can remember too that the newspapers then, some of them came out with black borders on the front page. That was amusing to see people so overreacting. But it was delightful to know that the Australian people agreed with us and that we won. Not only we won nationally, we won in every state, and Victoria was very close, but we won Victoria, and we won in 72, there was 72% of electorates. So it was not only legally a very sound win, a landslide, but in addition, we did win across the country because it was 72% of electorates. In fact, one person proposed to draw a map, usually size map like that, of Australia, and to show on it those parts that voted no and those parts that voted yes. The yes parts were so small you couldn't see them because they were all inner city electorates.
Yes.
So there was a bit of fun over that moment.
Okay, then we'll leave it there. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'd like to invite you back in the future and a bit of a conversation on local government, because you just touched on something that's rather sore and a sorry point in regards to Sydney City Council operating well without it outside its scope of authority and interest. Maybe we could have a look at Constitution and local government and the efforts people have tried to elevate local government and how it's also been underhandedly elevated by the way that they've been funded and some of the authority that they've been given by the states. So the states are getting lazy anyway. But look, tonight, thanks very much for your time. It's been a great pleasure, and I'll wrap up the show and introduce next week's. And thanks again, Professor David Flint.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Andrew, in the background, and thank you for the opportunity of being allowed to speak on your program.
Thank you. Next week's, join us again. Next week, we're looking forward to having the director of the Cairns and Far North Environmental Centre give us a talk on their founding courses and the direction they're going and the items that they put at the top of the charts in regards to the environment, we'll find out whether it's the Great Barrier Reef, climate change, or some other section in regards to our wildlife or our vegetation. If you enjoyed the show, please like, follow, and subscribe. You can also follow us on YouTube, and you can subscribe to the channel. Again, thanks very much for being the audience tonight, and join us again next week. Good night.
Okay, we're done. Thanks.
Rightio, thanks, Andrew.
You're right.
Yes, it was quite interesting. You just touched on Sydney Council, and they were obviously a problem back in those days in '95. But I think since Clover Moore's been in there, they've gone way outside the boundaries and scope of the things that they should be even looking at.
Yes,
My
sir.
opinion is it's roads, rates, and rubbish. That's about it. But it's nothing to do with foreign policy in regards to whether you back Hamas or Palestine against Israel. I find that, and what I find completely offensive is the fact that the Commonwealth and the states' governments don't pull them into line, because I think it's a disgrace. Just something like a local government can spend time and money on that sort of stuff.
You're so right. Well, thank you, Bill. It's been a great night.
Again, thanks very much. And like I said, if you had the chance to talk to the likes of Rowan Dean or anyone in that media group type situation to help promote our cause, it'd be much appreciated. And I do hope you'll join us again in the future in regards to